Good evening. I'm Chris Matthews in Washington. Like the historic conflict in the Middle East, the open war now between President-elect Donald Trump and the intelligence agencies continues. Trump calls the spy agencies Nazis. They, in turn, feel the need to share news of embarrassing, unsupported stories about him. Certainly, that's the way Trump sees it. The president-elect's very public dispute has already driven a wedge between U.S. intelligence community and the incoming Trump administration. And yet, as Trump indicated in his defiant press conference yesterday, he's still not ready to call a truce. Multiple times, Trump said that intelligence officials could be responsible for leaking information to the press. And he also stood by his tweet comparing those leaks to Nazi Germany.
They looked at that nonsense that was released by maybe the intelligence agencies. Who knows? But maybe the intelligence agencies, which would be a tremendous blot on their record if they in fact did that, a tremendous blot. I think it was disgraceful that the intelligence agencies allowed any information that turned out to be so false and fake out. I think it's a disgrace. And I say that, and that's something that Nazi Germany would have done and did do.
After a conversation with Trump last night, Director of National Intelligence James Clapper released a statement to deny responsibility for the leaks and note the unreliable veracity of that 35-page dossier, which was originally generated as part of an opposition research effort by anti-Trump Republicans. Quote, I emphasize that this document is not a U.S. intelligence community product and that I do not believe the leaks came from within the intelligence community. The intelligence community has not made any judgment that the information in this document is reliable. Well, this morning, the president-elect appeared to contradict the director on that latter point, saying that Clapper told him the document was not true. Quote, James Clapper called me yesterday to denounce the false and fictitious report that was illegally circulated, made up phony facts. Too bad. That was Trump. A summary of those inflammatory allegations was included in an appendix to the classified report on Russia and was shared with members of Congress, known as the Gang of Eight. There they are, last week. I'm joined right now by Panetta, the former director of the CIA, and, of course, former Secretary of Defense under President Obama. Mr. Director, Mr. Secretary, I should say as well, what do you think of the decision by the intelligence community, the CIA and the others, to distribute to all 8 members of the Gang of Eight, they're the ranking members and the chairman of the intelligence committees, but also the political leadership of both sides of the aisle and both sides of the hill, to distribute that widely, this 2-page attachment, which was not intelligence, but was some kind of information gathered by Oppo research operation about Trump. Was that wise to distribute it that widely?
Well, Chris, I think the standard that usually is followed here is that based on the briefing that they gave the President of the United States and then the briefing that they gave to the President-elect, the intelligence community is obligated to then present that briefing to the key leadership on Capitol Hill, both Republican and Democrat. So it's a standard procedure to present whatever briefing was presented to the president and to the president-elect to that group of leadership on Capitol Hill.
But the actual intelligence they gave him in terms of the Russian engagement in our campaign was the intelligence they gave him. And then they added this 2-page attachment, which they said was not intelligence, but was in fact some of this information. I think it was even marked disinformation. Why didn't they just hand it to Trump on the side or give it to one of his people rather than get it so widely distributed that somebody was probably going to leak it, especially somebody either in the Republican Party, perhaps more likely in the Democratic Party, was going to leak it to one of their contacts in the press, which apparently is what happened, unless you believe the CIA leaked it. Your thoughts? Somebody leaked it.
No, that's right. As we know from our own experience, that kind of thing gets leaked. You know, I don't know all the reasons that were involved in having that document accompany the full brief with regards to the Russian hacking. I suspect that because it involves sensitive information, even though it was unverified and had not been substantiated, that because it was so sensitive, they felt they had an obligation to present that to both the president and the president-elect. Normally, you do provide that kind of information. If you have an unsubstantiated report, even though it is unsubstantiated, if it is sensitive and if it is information that you believe, could very well ultimately be proven true, then usually even in intelligence briefings, that kind of information is provided with the condition that it is unsubstantiated and not verified.
Who do you think is the more likely suspect? The intelligence community? Now, Mr. Clapper has denied it on behalf of his community. That would include all the agencies involved. Or the Hill? Or the Hill? Where do you think it would come from? Those 8 members on the Hill or one of the officials
Chris,
Langley?
We always speculate.
Well, if you're Trump, what would you think? If you were Trump, what would you think was your enemy? Who was your enemy?
9 presidents and 2 presidents in the Oval Office, and all of them hate it when anything is leaked. President Clinton was that way. President Obama was that way. Things get leaked, and it's frustrating, it's angering, but it's also the reality of Washington. As to who did it, you just don't know. I believe, Jim Clapper, that it wasn't in the intelligence community that did that. But when you're presenting those briefings, and if there are a lot of staff members that are present, then obviously it becomes vulnerable to some kind of leak.
Yeah. Well, in his confirmation hearing today, by the way, Trump's pick for the head of the CIA, Congressman Mike Pompeo, took a hard line on Putin and said he'd pursue any lead regarding an untoward relationship between the Trump campaign and Russia. This is looking forward, Mr. Director. Let's watch.
There are unsubstantiated media reports that there were contacts between the Trump campaign and the Russians. If confirmed, will you commit to exploring those questions? And if you find there is validity to those allegations, refer the information that you discovered to the FBI?
I promise I will pursue the facts wherever they take us. The Central Intelligence Agency has that as one of its singular functions, and you have my commitment that I'll do that with respect to this issue and each and every other issue as well.
Well, what is not clear at this time, at least, is whether the U.S. intelligence community is currently investigating alleged connections between Trump, his campaign, and Moscow. Mr. Panetta, I guess that's a tricky question. I remember in your book, I was just reading it today, one of the parts of your book, you talked about one of the reasons that CIA is out of the city, it's over in Langley, Virginia, is to keep the spies away from Washington and the political figures. Is this going to be really tricky to have the CIA investigating the guy who's just about to be our president, in fact, continuing to investigate, if Mr. Pompeo is right, about his possible, perhaps bad, malicious somehow involvement with the Russians before his campaign was over? And then, in other words, was there engagement by him with the Russians in a way that helped his campaign? That's a fruitful area of investigation, but how do you do that while the president's in office?
Well, you do it very carefully. The reality is that the FBI obviously would be one of those agencies to investigate those allegations, and at least according to the director, it appears that they may very well have an investigation on that issue, and obviously the CIA might very well conduct a similar investigation. You would hope that those efforts would be coordinated, but the reality is that when it comes to investigating something that it may involve the violation of the law, the White House really does not have much authority to be able to shut those investigations down. Normally, it happens at the Justice Department, and while it can be frustrating for a president, the reality is that the Justice Department is free to conduct that kind of investigation along with other agencies.
You've worked with agents, and I can tell you a heartfelt feeling for those agents over in our officials in Langley, the people who risk their lives and used to get the Medal of Freedom just for them, the stars on the wall. And they really do go into scary, frightening situations which would drive most people crazy just to be there for a second in these foreign countries that maybe they hate us and they'd like to kill us, and they do. And what does that do to the morale of those to be called Nazis, basically, by Trump? And I'm not being explosive here. Those were his words.
Yeah, no, I really regret that. It's not a good situation for our country, Chris, to have the President of the United States and soon to be Commander-in-Chief having this kind of contentious relationship with the intelligence community. It's not good for our national security. It's not good for the country. Sends the wrong message to our enemies that we don't have our act together. It You know, it really does impact the credibility of the information that they're going after. But more importantly, as you point out, it impacts the morale of those that are involved. And look, these are not Republicans and Democrats. These are good Americans who are working hard to try to provide the best intelligence possible to the president. And as you said, they have to put their life on the line. These are very risky operations when it involves these resources going out and trying to get intelligence in Russia, in Iran, in North Korea, in ISIS, some very, very troubling areas. And they put their lives on the line. And if they believe that somehow the President of the United States doesn't trust what they're presenting, make no mistake about it, it's going to impact the quality of intelligence that we get.
You're a great man. Leon Panetta, thanks so much for your service to our country in so many ways. I'm joined right now by David Ignatius, columnist for the Washington Post, who knows these people as well as any journalist in the country. Let's talk about this strange fight. The question I put to Leon Panetta there, the former director, the former defense chief, was it smart and was it fair for the intelligence community to release this terrible stuff, this dossier, if you will, of unsupported charges against Trump on such a wide loop, to give it to all the intelligence committee members and ranking members, Democrats and Republicans, leadership on both sides, with the strong possibility that somebody's going to show it to a staff or somebody's going to give it to a favorite reporter. And somebody did.
So,
somebody did.
You know, I think it's important to get the sequence right here. The first decision that Clapper, the director of national intelligence, had to make was, when this dossier is out, and it's been out for months.
Yeah.
Reporters have been working
but
on
not
it
used.
for months.
Nobody's put it in print until now.
No, but it was out. It was in the hands of the FBI. Senator John McCain said he gave it to the FBI on December 9. So the Clapper's decision was, given this, in briefing the president-elect, don't I need to tell him what's out there?
But why did he have to tell all the other people who are adversarial to him?
So Director Panetta just answered that. It is standard procedure when you're briefing the president or the president-elect that you brief the leadership, the Gang of Eight, as we call it.
You think
And
it was appropriate in this case?
If you didn't do it, they would complain that you were violating procedures. That's just
but we
the way
know
the
what
rules
happened, David. You're a journalist. What happened was this gave license to the blog, to the websites out there to take it. BuzzFeed grabbed this as license. It was a catalyst for them. Okay, you're going to give a 2-page attachment out. We'll show the whole 35-page dossier. And that's what happened.
It gave a news hook for a story that...
Is that fair to Trump?
I think it was appropriate to brief him on what this has been all over.
He doesn't think so.
The question, well, he shouldn't. I mean, the people who leaked it damaged him. I think you have to distinguish between the CNN story, which said the facts, that he had been given this annex that described, they only used general terms, investigation by a former British intelligence officer into possible contacts between the Russians and the Trump campaign. Distinguish between that and BuzzFeed putting out the whole document, unredacted, with all the salacious details, are not the same thing.
Let me ask you about the Russian relationship, because it's your two questions, and they're huge, because you know more than anybody about this. Is there a possibility, first of all, why do you think Trump is always giving wiggle room to Putin? Always saying, well, it may be him, it may not be him. He doesn't want to charge Putin with anything. And a larger question, is it reasonable of him to assume that we might be able to improve our relations with the Russians to get back to where we were 20 or 30 years ago? Is that a reasonable goal?
Two questions, two answers. First, I think Trump genuinely believes that it's important to improve relations with Russia. And it's hard to argue that point. Our relations have been poisonous. It's dangerous when you have Russian jets buzzing U.S. warships in the Baltic. That's not so I think that's correct. The question is, what's the price of that rapprochement? And a lot of people would say the Russians really do need to change their behavior. Second, you know, is it realistic to do it? Yeah, I think it can be done, but I actually think this whole flap, whatever the Russians may have intended with their hacking, has made it much more difficult to get to where they want. There's now a big impediment. When you hear General Mattis today, Mike Pompeo, the CIA director, almost swearing that they're going to be hardliners on Russia,